Assalamu alaikum. Let's open up with Al-Fatiha, and then we will begin the presentation for today. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa bil Al-Amin. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata mustaqim. Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim. Ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Amin. All right, on behalf of the Talim Committee, Doctors Aisha El-Amin and Dr. Gloria Bashir, as well as Sister Rashida Fitzpatrick, I want to welcome you to today's Talim. My name is Lionel Allen Jr., and I'm going to be facilitating today's Talim. The topic is education in a Trump world. And my objective or goal today is to try to articulate what's at stake as it relates to public education now that Trump has been elected to his second term. Some of the things I'm going to discuss today are things that I touched on last year when I talked about the efforts to eradicate truth from how history was taught or is being taught in public schools across the United States of America. And so today is kind of a sad presentation in the sense that some of these things that we were fearful of a year or 2 years ago have a high likelihood of coming to fruition because not only has Trump been elected to his second term, but he also has control of the Supreme Court. And it looks very likely that the Republicans will have control of Congress. And so what that means is Trump, in large part, will have carte blanche to do whatever it is he wants to do. And so there's implications for that that are broad and far-reaching. But today, I'm only going to focus on public education because that happens to be, my area of greatest knowledge. My name is Lionel Allen Jr. again, and I'm an educator. I'm a college professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. But prior to my time at the university, I spent over 20 years in public education as a teacher, as a school leader, and as a network leader. And so I'm intimately involved in this educational space. And so I have a great deal of concern about the path that we seem to be going down as it relates to public education. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I did create a slide deck that I want to share with those who are joining us now and those who may view the presentation later. So assuming everyone can see my screen, I want to say that Trump was very clear on what he wanted to accomplish as part of his second term. And much of his policy ideas, much of the changes that he seeks to make have been codified in the document that we know as Project 2025, which is a 900-page document that lays out exactly what his mandate is as president of the United States. And it's based in large part on Christian nationalist perspectives. And it actually moves the country more towards an autocracy. It consolidates presidential power, and it gives President Trump and the executive branch a great deal of power and authority to undermine institutions that we have come to enjoy, institutions that have been a big part of what has protected, our civil rights in the United States. And when I say our, I'm referring to historically marginalized people of color. And so we should all be very concerned that with this consolidation of power, what Donald Trump and his cronies will be able to push forward and to accomplish with this second term. Throughout the campaign, he talked about how he wasn't aware of what Project 2025 was, that he had no connection to individuals that were in any way involved in Project 2025. And we all knew at the time that it wasn't true. But I'm just using this gentleman as an example, Russell Vaught, who's was intimately involved with Project 2025, and one of the authors um, has been named nominee for the Office of Management and Budget. So he more than likely will be the director of the Office of Management and Budget, which is a very powerful budget role within the federal government. And so we knew then that we could not take him at his word, and now we continue to be sort of bombarded with evidence that speaks to exactly what he was trying to do and how dishonest he was as it relates to his sort of knowledge, understanding, and quite frankly, support of Project 2025. But as I said just a few minutes ago, what I want to focus on today, because again, that document is 900 pages and it covers a lot, and I recommend folks to take a look at it, even if you read just a summation of it. It's very eye-opening. It's very concerning, and we all need to be aware of what's coming. Because again, the plan has been laid out for us to read if we are willing to engage with it that way. Again, the focus of today's Talim, though, is to focus directly on education, because again, there's implications for those of us who are educators, or those of us who are interested in becoming educators, or those of us who have children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews in public schools. We need to be aware of what's coming. I begin by saying that education is a state responsibility. And so it says very clearly in the 10th Amendment that any powers not delegated to the United States by the U.S. Constitution are reserved to the states. And so education will be one of those sort of powers that's not explicitly delegated to the United States by the Constitution. And the reason why I bring that up is because some might ask the question, well, who's ultimately responsible for educational institutions and how they function? And again, that would be the state. So to give you an example of something that a state is responsible for, states are responsible for certification practices and policies, or another way of saying that would be licensures, policies, or practice. So when you are applying to be an educator in the state of Illinois, for example, whether you want to be a principal, an assistant principal, a teacher, or a paraprofessional / teacher assistant, the state dictates the steps that you must take to earn that licensure. That doesn't come from the federal government. The states also are responsible for setting curricular standards. The federal government does not dictate in any way curriculum that states must follow. The state dictates how many days of attendance students need to have in a given school year. The federal government does not in any way manage that. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, it was states that were making the decisions in consultation with local districts as to whether or not their schools were going to open up or remain closed. The federal government could not authorize during that time frame schools to open up. They also couldn't authorize schools to close. So the relationship between educational institutions and the federal government is complex. And so I want to unpack that a little bit because it's helpful, I think, to understand the role that the federal government plays. And so I'll start addressing that by saying this. A lot of what the federal government is responsible for as it relates to education is protecting the rights of highly marginalized populations of students. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. And so the state provides a great deal of funding. The feds, provide a great deal of funding to states for the purposes of ensuring that every child in every state in the union has access to a high quality education, and that they are protected from discrimination. They are protected from barriers that make it difficult to access high quality education. And so states rely on that funding right, to provide additional programming, to help increase the numbers of staff members and teachers that are serving our children. So the states are highly reliant upon that funding. And by extension, local districts are very reliant upon that funding. The feds also, again, hold districts accountable, right, to making sure that they are acting in the best interest. Now, I know we can, as you hear me say this, you probably are sort of rolling your eyes. I certainly would be, because we know that the federal government has done, through their policies, has done much harm to historically marginalized communities, communities of color, et cetera, et cetera. So I recognize and I acknowledge that. But I also think it's important that we understand that more than one thing can be true. So yes, there have been a great deal of sort of undermining of Black and brown communities, of marginalized communities, of poor communities, that was due to some of the policies that have been enacted by the federal government. But there's also been a great deal of protection that we have been able to rely upon as it relates to the federal government too. So we can point to a couple of things that have happened historically, and I'll point a few of those things out that served as ways to protect the interests of people of color in particular. And so when Donald Trump says that his nominee for the U.S. Department of Education, or the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, is going to be somebody that's going to shepherd the return of the responsibility totally to the states, that gives me great concern, because historically, states have not shown that they have had the ability, nor quite frankly, the interest in protecting the rights of African American and Latino children and or white children who live in poverty. So we think about rural white children and the struggles that they face in having access to high quality educational programming. If not for the federal government, those children would be in more trouble than that they're in right now. And so it gives me great concern when the incoming president and his cabinet says things like, education should solely be a state responsibility, and we should not be playing any role in helping to sort of govern or manage what's happening at the state level. We know that when that happens, bad things could occur. And so I am, as I've said before, tremendously concerned about the state of public education when we no longer have any sense of protection. So let me transition to what has been bubbling up for years now, and this really started during Biden's presidency, when there was an attack on truth and there was an attack on history within our schools. So those of you who had an opportunity to listen to a presentation that I've delivered, I don't know if it was last year or a few months ago, on the eradication of truth and how we educate students. These bills that were being proposed, and in some cases passed in state legislatures around the nation, that basically eliminated any reference to slavery or oppression, that made it difficult for schools to purchase textbooks that address those issues directly. Anything essentially that made white students feel uncomfortable or white families uncomfortable they're proposing that those things be outlawed, that we cannot talk about slavery in a way that really illuminates the tragedy and the horrors associated with slavery. When, for example, in Florida, when they are instructing schools to frame slavery as it wasn't all bad, that if not for slavery, African American people would not have learned certain skills. When districts are forced to adhere to those types of policies, it creates a culture war within our schools, because you have families of color who are being harmed by some of these policies. We can't talk about the Civil War, for example, as being a war that was about slavery. Instead, it's framed as if it was a war that was solely about economics and about states' rights. Like those kinds of things are now being sort of legislated, right? That it's, schools who aren't falling in line with that ideology are being punished. And they're saying, and they're using phrases like critical race theory. They're using terms like indoctrination as justification for not allowing those things to be taught, right? They're using this term divisive concepts. That essentially any real teaching of history in the history of the United States of America, anything that covers race or racism or prejudice or bias, those things can no longer be taught because they're considered to be divisive, right? That it makes certain groups of students and their families feel uncomfortable. So we can't address those things in school, right? We can't build a student's cultural competence or really deepen their understanding of why the world is the way that it is. And so you have this culture of fear that lives within our schools. And I'm not saying this or sharing this based off of something that I read. I'm actually experiencing it. I was working with a school district not too long ago. I won't say the name of the school district, but the topic of my presentation was culturally responsible school leadership, moving from theory to practice. And so in this presentation, I am trying to empower and give school leaders and district leaders the tools to be able to become more culturally responsive, to create the conditions where every child has an opportunity to be successful. And the pushback that I received was, we can't really address concepts of race and culture in our schools because we are afraid that school board members might be angry with us, and teachers are afraid that their jobs might be on the line, and principals are afraid that they may lose their jobs or become the victim of some sort of attack campaign on social media like Facebook or Instagram, where people might say horrible things about them because they're trying to serve a population of students that need to be served. But in order to do that, we have to address some of these issues around race, around culture, and around class. And there's a group of highly vocal people, highly connected people who have a great deal of social and political capital who are using their power and privilege in ways that silence folks who really are being harmed, right? And so now that Trump has been reelected, that just emboldens these individuals who believe that we should not be addressing these issues, that we shouldn't be talking about identity, we shouldn't be talking about race, we shouldn't be talking about the privileged versus the non-privileged. We shouldn't be addressing these issues in school. And so you have teachers who are afraid to teach. And as a former teacher, that's of great concern of mine, because I love to, create opportunities for students to debate social and political issues in class. Let's talk about slavery. Let's talk about World War II. Let's talk about whether or not we should have dropped the atomic bomb. Like that's the purpose, in my opinion, of a social science curriculum. That's the purpose of a history class, is to really debate some of these issues. And I would have loved to have been a history teacher during this time, but the more I think about it, I don't know if I would have loved it, especially if I'm handcuffed, especially if I can't teach certain books or I can't use certain pieces of text, because people would push back on that. And it's not just the K-12 level. I have colleagues who have had experiences as university professors where they have to send their syllabi, their course syllabi, to representatives of the state legislatures to make sure that it isn't a woke syllabus, right? Like they're actually this pressure, not just from their university, but from the legislators in their state, to make sure that they aren't perpetuating a woke ideology through their syllabus, right? And so that's of concern, because now we are handcuffing or constraining intellectual discourse, right? We can't debate the facts, or we can't debate the outcomes of certain decisions that are being made, because again, that's considered to be indoctrination, that's considered to be woke. And if we talk about slavery and little white kids feel bad, then that's a no-no. We cannot do that, right? Even though we know that, our society, the American society in large part, was built off of racism and slavery, and it's sort of baked into these ideologies around white supremacy and Black oppression, are sort of baked into the fabric of our nation. but we can't address those things. So students, kids, children have no real understanding if we don't provide that understanding of why the world exists the way it exists, why are certain groups of people historically been sort of relegated to positions of subjugation. We can never talk about that in schools, right? Because that makes people feel bad. And so you have teachers and educators being caught up in this situation where they just don't feel like they have the protection, they don't have the cover, they haven't been sort of liberated to address some of these issues. And if it's not happening in our schools, then where is it supposed to happen? So Trump has been very vocal about eliminating the U.S. Department of Education, and so why is that of concern to us? And I'll share some specifics in just a few minutes. But one of the components or segments of the U.S. Department of Education is the Office for Civil Rights, and its primary responsibility is to ensure that every child has equal access, right, to education, right? And we know that that's not happening, even with the Office of Civil Rights in place. That's not happening, right? We recognize that one of the main issues that we have in public education in this country is a lack of equal access to high quality and comprehensive educational opportunities and experiences. We recognize that. But that's the purpose of the Office of Civil Rights. If the Department of Education goes away, so does the Office of Civil Rights, right? Because I doubt that they will then move that to a different department within the federal government. And so what that means is that we don't have any protection. And I've had direct interactions with the Office of Civil Rights as I was managing a situation at a school that I once worked at where a student with special needs was not being serviced properly. And the family, in making sure that they were protecting the rights of their child, went to the state and they eventually went to the federal government. And the Office of Civil Rights stepped in and said, "Hey, these things must be done. And if you don't do these things, we're going to pull federal funding." So we know that there are issues all over where students aren't being serviced properly or being mistreated or being harmed. And that's with the Office of Civil Rights in place, right? Imagine what could happen if you remove that mechanism of protection. I shudder at the thought. And so we think about the U.S. Department of Education being in danger and essentially going away. I want to make sure, one, that you understand why the U.S. Department of Education is so important. So I began this presentation by saying that the primary authority of education rests in the hands of state legislatures. However, the federal government plays an integral role. And so let me just share just a few things that the federal government has done to, again, protect the educational rights of marginalized populations of students and their families. And a couple of these you will recognize, maybe some of them you won't. But I'll start with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. And what that does is that mandates that schools provide a free and appropriate public education for every student with a disability. Right. So I don't know if you all remember this, but I remember, as a child, if you were a student with special needs, and I'm not in my 80s, right? I remember this very vividly. I'm talking about the late 80s and 1990s, where students with special needs, well, you didn't see them during the day. They were put in a classroom that was in the basement or down the hallway, and they didn't interact with their non-disabled peers, and they didn't have an opportunity to really experience the full depth and breadth of the educational experience because they had been labeled, right, with some sort of disability. And so what IDEA does is it guarantees that those kinds of things can no longer happen. Like schools and school districts are being held accountable for how they service students with IEPs. And so if you take the U.S. Department of Education away, if you take away the Office of Civil Rights, it becomes increasingly difficult for schools to be held accountable to these things, right? If we look at ESSA or ESSA, right, which gives funding to states and to local districts to address achievement disparities between racialized groups of students and students who live below the poverty line. right? These are funds, right, that are provided to schools at the state and local level. Everybody's familiar with No Child Left Behind, and we know the negative sort of consequences of No Child Left Behind, particularly on the educational infrastructure in the Black community. But right, it was a mechanism that served to hold schools and school districts accountable. Now, I have written and have debated with folks about how problematic No Child Left Behind was and is, and we are still dealing with the ramifications of that. However, what it did do is it put schools on notice. Now, accountability does not lead to school improvement. So I want to be very clear. It was problematic in a lot of different ways. But what it did say is you can no longer be okay with generations of students being failed by your institution. That we're going to be tracking literacy performance, we're going to be tracking mathematical performance, and there are going to be consequences when schools don't hit certain benchmarks. Now, again, the methodology was flawed, but the idea that no child will be left behind because of a poor academic experience, the idea or the intent was positive, right? It's now, if you take the entity that is the U.S. Department of Education away, that's primarily responsible for enacting those types of policies and those types of laws, you take that away, then what will happen is what's been happening, which is people have normalized the failures of Black and brown kids. People have normalized the failure of poor kids. And so if there isn't an entity that's in place that's going to ensure that somebody is going to, at the very least, be paying attention to the educational plight of these individual children and their families, that goes away, then what happens? What happens? Right? And so the U.S. Department of Education, in large part, through some of these acts that you see here, what they have done is they have shone a light on the inequities that exist within our educational institutions. They have provided funding to help schools and school districts to address some of these inequities. Have the results been great? Absolutely not. But it's been something, right? These acts and some of this legislation that has come out of the federal government that has been enacted and monitored and governed by the U.S. Department of Education have helped to outlaw discrimination, right, on the basis of race, color, sex, or national origin. If you take those protections away, then what happens to our educational system, right? And that is something that I think that we all need to be concerned about, that this isn't just a situation where we can say, well, the federal government has never really played any role. The federal government has never really helped us. Yeah, our schools are jacked up in our communities. We understand that, right? We understand that, we acknowledge it. And we got to take some responsibility, some collective responsibility for the state of our schools and our communities. But we also have to acknowledge that we have been able to, whenever we wanted to make a change or whenever we wanted to hold folks accountable for doing harm to kids, there's been a path that we can take to get to where we want to go. And now there's a block in the path. Now they're saying, no, you can't go to the feds now. That the only institution that you can go to will be at the state level. And that, again, should be something that we are concerned with and something that we need to be really thoughtful and considerate of as we think about the future of education in our communities. So a couple of things that I want to point out, and then I'm going to open it up, hopefully for some questions and some discussion, so that we can, hopefully make sense of this together. We think about Title IX. Title IX it provides supplemental funding to schools that serve students that live below the poverty line. So we think about the importance of Title IX. If you are a school that serves a large number of low-income students, you receive a significant amount of Title IX funding. And it is funding that school leaders like myself, when I was leading a school, depend upon to provide programming to our students who really struggled for a variety of different reasons, to provide staffing for those students. And so if you take away any sort of responsibility from the federal government to support our schools, you are essentially taking away the funding. The funding goes with it. And we can kid ourselves into believing that they'll just provide that funding to the states. That's not going to happen. Once the funding is pulled, the funding is pulled, right? And because we know that this administration is not all that interested in fortifying and strengthening our public educational system, right? So another big push is something called vouchers, where students will be given these vouchers to be able to attend parochial schools or private schools or religious schools, which I'm not necessarily saying is a bad thing, but the vouchers come at the expense of public institutions. And not everybody is interested in sending their child to a parochial school. Not everyone is interested in sending their child to a private school. Public education should be a right. Everybody should have the right to send their child to a high quality public school. And quite frankly, they should have a right to send their child to a high quality public school in their neighborhood. We know that that isn't currently happening, right? And so it's not happening now. If you take away, again, the governing body that, at least in theory, is working to make that a possibility, if you take that away, then what's our reality? Right. And so I remember as a principal, when I would get my budget every spring, I essentially had three budget lines. I had a budget line that was directly from Chicago Public Schools. I had a budget line that was from the state of Illinois, and I had a budget line that came from the federal government. We called it No Child Left Behind funding or Title IX funding. We kind of use those terms interchangeably. That's not the correct way to frame it, but essentially that's what it is. And so a large portion of my budget came from the federal government. And it's because at that time, my school, we served a population of students where 98, 99% of them were low income. So that was a big pot of money. And so I'm thinking about this as a former practitioner, where I'm saying to myself, if I'm leading a school in Inglewood, and we already know that there are funding inequities in the educational system, right? The way we fund schools is inherently unequal, and it fosters and perpetuates greater inequities in our school, right? And I don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but we know that schools in the suburbs are funded through property taxes, right? And so the richer your community is, oftentimes the better and the more resourced your school is. And I witnessed it today. Mason had baseball practice out in LaGrange. You go out to LaGrange and you see the way their schools look, where their parks look. You can see very clearly. He can see it, right? He can see it. But we would go out to different suburbs and he would see what the schools look like and look at the way the park districts look like. He would ask me, Dad, how come our parks look like they look, but out here it's like a different world? This is a kid 9, 10 years old who's making a connection between the resources that some communities have versus others, right? So we know that the funding formulas are inherently unequal and perpetuating inequities. So if you take away this big pot of money, so if you say now that schools are only going to be funded through their local districts or through the state government, that federal funding goes away because they're going to reallocate that to something else. What then happens to the quality of the school experience? What are principals going to be able to provide for their students? If you took away my federal funding when I was a principal, I don't know how I would have made it, because so many programs, so many staff members were tied to that funding. If you took that money away and said, we're going to take that money and now we're going to give it in the form of vouchers, we're going to give parents an opportunity for universal enrollment. They can go anywhere they want. And because of where my school was, very few parents would have chosen, right, to send their child to a school in Inglewood that has a reputation of being underfunded. What does that do to the quality of the school choices that parents and families have? Right. And we know who that benefits. We know that school choice, and there are issues with this idea of school choice, because really the choices that parents have, it comes down to a lot of other decisions than just what they think is the best school for their child. It comes down to how far away are the schools that they want their child to go to. It comes down to whether or not their child is going to be welcomed at the school that they have set their sights on. Has the child been prepared to succeed at this new? So there's a lot. And again, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because that's a whole nother Talim. But my point here, and if you don't remember anything else that I'm saying as it relates to this particular topic, is if we take federal funding away, or if we drastically reduce the federal funding that schools receive, the implications of that are far-reaching and devastating. Devastating. So you have schools in Inglewood and on the west side of Chicago and in rural white communities who rely very heavily on this Title IX funding, the Title I funding. And again, the implications are far-reaching, right? And then here, what you see here, this Title IX legislation that protects students from being discriminated on the basis of sex and gender. That's super, super important, right? Because we know that students' educational experiences are often undermined based on their racial identification, but also based on their gender classifications as well. And so we think about girls having access to sports and things like that. Like all that came through because of Title IX funding. The Title I funding, right, is about giving money to schools to support students to address some of these achievement inequities that we see. So I want us to understand that schools are relying upon this money. And if it goes away, it's going to create many more problems that don't currently exist now. And if they do exist, they exist in ways that are way more manageable than if we got rid of this federal funding. Again, going back to Title I, 90% of schools in the U.S. public school system receive some sort of Title I funding. 90%. Because, right, this funding is given to, schools that serve children who live below the poverty line or considered to be low income. And so, again, you take away that funding and that creates tremendous problems. The last thing that I want to, bring up in the context of this conversation, something that we should be worried about is the possibility that Head Start goes away. Because Head Start is a federally funded program that focuses in on providing school experiences for children who are 0 to 5 years old. Programs like Pre-K for All, it comes out of the Head Start program. We know that when children are not in school, when they, for example, spend the first 2, 3, 4 years of their lives at grandma's house and not in a structured educational environment, like we know that puts them behind the academic 8 ball, right? When they aren't hearing language spoken to them, when they aren't interacting with manipulatives, when they aren't seeing the world, when because of financial reasons, I'm struggling. I got 2 little kids and I can't afford to pay for preschool. And those of us who pay for daycare, daycare is super expensive. Those of us who remember how much it cost us, right? Like we're talking about, in some cases, I know people who pay $1,500 a month to send their kid to daycare so they can have some sense of what school is like, right? Parents who struggle to find high quality pre-K programs, they certainly couldn't pay for them. And the only reason why their child is in pre-K is because, they qualify for the Head Start program. Imagine if you take that away. Like what happens then, right? If I can't get money to send my child to school, or if I don't qualify for a program where I can send my child to have a pre-kindergarten experience for free, then what are my options? Because again, we know that when, we love grandmothers, we love aunties, right? But we know unless they are trained, right, as early childhood educators, any child that is placed in that environment, right, they're not having the kind of mental stimulation that they need to be on the right track to have success in school. And so, again, going back to my days as a principal, I could tell when I went into a kindergarten classroom, I can tell within a few minutes of observing a student whether or not they had gone to preschool or not. Because the students who did not go to preschool oftentimes could not recognize the letters in their name. They could not hold the book upright. There were things that we could see that they could not do, which again puts them, not saying that they could never catch up, right? Because in the right conditions they can, but they struggled. They would struggle academically, at least for the first few years, because they had not had that exposure to numbers, to the alphabet, to conversations. I mean, I had students who, as kindergartners, because they had not been in any sort of formal educational environment, who didn't even know what their real name was. They only knew their nickname, right? They couldn't tell you their first and last name as kindergartners, right? So these are the kinds of things that are at stake, right? And so, again, my objective and my purpose today was to try to help. And I know it's kind of a depressing picture, but I wanted to provide a picture of what is on the horizon if we don't assert more responsibility in how our children are educated, right? And so, like, the question should be, so now what? So now what do we do? If the states are going to be empowered, and we're going to see over the next term, the next 4 years, states being given more and more authority, and the federal government relinquishing or surrendering some of that authority over the course of 4 years, to the point where they're going to be playing a very little role in the governance of public educational systems in the United States, then that means that we have to be willing to jump on the local school council. We got to be willing to join and run for school boards, because entities that have an interest in undermining the quality of public education, or entities that are very interested in whitewashing or eliminating the coverage of any sort of quote unquote controversial issues in American history, and when all those things pulled out of schools, they are highly organized. They are highly organized. And they are on those school boards, and they're running for reelection, and they're running for local government positions. And they are positioning themselves to make it very difficult, right, for us to be able to pass legislation that's in the best interest of folks that have been historically harmed in this country. African American people, Latino people, poor white people, non-Christian folk, right? Like, it's going to be very difficult. Remember, Project 2025 is written in large part from a Christian nationalist perspective. That is the mandate that they've given Donald Trump. That's what they've organized around. And we see it popping up in places like Oklahoma, in places like Louisiana. And again, my mother is Christian. I don't have anything against Christians. I was raised in a Christian family. I got much love, right, for my family. But I'm also concerned that they're mandating that the Ten Commandments be posted in schools in Louisiana. I'm also concerned that teachers are going to be instructed in some states to have to teach the Bible, right? What does that mean for students who aren't Christian? And how does that show up? How is that going to be used to either disempower or empower, maybe, but mostly probably disempower students who don't identify as Christian? These are things that I'm very concerned about, and I want you to be concerned about them as well. But more than being concerned, the question that we have to ask ourselves is how are we going to take action? And again, when we think of things like federal funding, like Title I funding, or protections like Title IX, when we think about pieces of legislation that have been designed, maybe weren't successful, but at least were designed to protect the interests of marginalized people in this country. If you take those protections away, what happens to the state of our communities? What happens to our schools? What happens to the future of our children? And it's something that we all should be concerned about. So I'll stop there. I see Dr. Aisha has her hand raised. Jump on in, sister.
So thank you so much, Dr. Lionel. as always, really, really sound information. Uh, you you have covered quite a bit, and I wasn't able to log on until later. So I don't know if you covered some of the things in higher ed, because I was going to highlight a few of the things that we're also looking at with these changes in higher ed, if not, but I didn't want to be redundant.
No, no, please do. I was going to go there, but I was like, you know what? It's so much to cover, but go ahead, please.
It's
Help
so
us.
much. It's so much. It's two things that come to mind in particular that I want to share with folks around the Department of Education and the elimination of that and the rhetoric around that. FAFSA is another portion that the Department of Education oversees, and FAFSA is the federal application for funds, and so. Essentially, those are the grants, those are the funds, the financial aid that the federal government gives to students who are low income, right? And so one example of that is at UIC, we have a 60% population that's Pell eligible. So they are funded through the FAFSA. They're funded through that mechanism. So just imagine if they took that away and no one to oversee FAFSA, and those students now don't have a way in order to pay for college, right? And they have to fill this out yearly. So you would have students at every level from um, first of all, accessing college to begin with, but then I'm about to finish and now I have no way of paying for that. So there's so many kind of intricacies that the Department of Education holds the space in to make sure that so many things are done. Another thing, and this is kind of outside of the Department of Education, but that has come on our radar recently, is the College Cost Reduction Act, CCRA. And essentially there's a lot of pieces of that, but the biggest piece that will impact some of the day to day and students having access, which is one of my biggest concerns, is it will eliminate the student loan plus um, so the plus loans. So essentially, most of our graduate students use the plus loans, right? So in our dentistry, in our medical school, most of those students are using those plus loans because they don't qualify for that free financial, and they also can't pay out of pocket. So it's this it's really that middle income who take those plus loans in order to pay for graduate school. And we have a very diverse medical and dental school. So essentially, what this act would do is it would eliminate access for that middle group, because in the Department of Ed is also eliminated. So you got the lower income eliminated because they can't afford it. You have the middle income because they can't take loans out in order to go to these graduate spaces. And so really all you have is those people that can pay out of pocket. So those are the more affluent groups. And so what does that do for the diversity of the field of healthcare, of dentistry, of all those fields that the professionals that would complete these professional degrees would go into? And so there's a rippling effect for generations to come. And we know what healthcare systems look like when we don't have representation from the folks that are being serviced, right? And so I just wanted to add those pieces. But like you said, it's so many pieces of this.
Yeah.
And a lot is always in control, but we need to tie our camel. And so we need to understand what these things do and what the impact is of them, and how we can prepare ourselves to push against those things and find alternative mechanisms to support access to education. Thanks.
100%. Thank you for sharing that. I'll just add one more thing when it comes to higher ed, and that is the fear that students are having in terms of filling out the FAFSA. They're undocumented, right?
Yes.
They're afraid of being deported. So we got a whole generation of students who don't even want to complete the FAFSA, right? Because they are afraid that it might expose their parents, and it's a mess, right? It really is, and I don't think we quite understand, and we won't understand just how much this affects us, our students, and those that we serve. And again, something that we have to be mindful of. Dr. Aisha just laid out, and that's just a snippet, right? I'm sure she can probably do a whole Talim just on the impact that this would have on higher ed. So again, that goes back to what I started with, which is this culture of fear. Think about it. All you want to do is go to college, but you're so afraid that your parents might be deported. You won't even fill out a FAFSA to get money so you can go to college because of that fear. Think about that. Now, those of us that identify as African American, those who have been born here, et cetera, like we don't have that fear. But there are many students uh, who want to contribute to American society. I mean, I know principals, right, who came to this country undocumented and are and are doing a wonderful job of serving the needs of children and families, running schools and having great success. Imagine if we no longer have those individuals leading those schools and those institutions because they've been deported or because they couldn't finish college because they didn't have the money to do so. It's just really it's heartbreaking when you think about the ramifications of these kinds of things. Any other comments or questions? Brother Bill, jump in, please. Brother Bill, Assalamu alaikum.
There we go. Sorry.
That's okay.
Assalamu alaikum. I just wanted to expand on a couple of things that Dr. Aisha just brought up. One of the things that I've learned, my younger son is a faculty counselor at College of DuPage, and he always talks to me about the really large number of undocumented students there, from all kinds of different backgrounds. And if you think about some of the things that you were talking about, and also Dr. Aisha, just being able to get, even though social community colleges are cheaper, certainly, but even to expose yourself to be able to go there, even though it doesn't cost that much money, but it still costs money that you might need to get. One of the other things that strikes me is that a lot of those students are undergoing multiple pressures. I mean, from this new administration. I mean, all we've been hearing continually is, I'm going to deport 1 million people. Trump just said something about, you might have mentioned this, that he's going to get away from giving citizenship to children that were born here, but their parents aren't citizens. We got the whole DACA group of people that are very worried. So those students that are undocumented, I mean, they're concerned about themselves and their whole family, maybe being picked up and, like you said, identified, but also, coming up with the money to be able to go through a program, even if it's only 2 years. And I was there doing some presentation on something, and they were talking about they have a large number of Palestinian students. Well, talking about mental health crises, the Palestinian students there just don't even know how to even go to college. So I think that's one of the things that you've talked about, but just recognizing that in the new administration, there's many people wanting to go to college or already in or whatever, that it's not just, trying to get money. It's also, am I going to get deported, or is my whole family going to be, picked up?
Yep. Oh, you're absolutely right. Again, this culture of fear is real. And we're all trying to figure out ways to better support, our students who are undocumented, who come from families where maybe their parents are undocumented. But again, the breadth of Donald Trump saying the federal government will be limiting its involvement in the provision of education is scary. And again, Allah knows, but we have to be mindful of the impact that this is going to have on our communities. Yeah. Any other comments? Questions? Well, I thank you all, for your time today. The sun is shining brightly outside, not a cloud in the sky. So there are other things you could have been doing, but you're here with me, and I appreciate that. Anything good that has come from this presentation comes from Allah. Any mistakes, anything that I said that I've offended anyone, comes from me. let's close out with Wal Asr, and I look forward to seeing you all next Sunday, inshallah, where we're going to have Sister Amy Al-Mateen, who's going to be facilitating, presenting on setting some health and fitness goals for 2025. So, inshallah, we look forward to seeing you then. Again, on behalf of the Talim Committee, Dr. Aisha El-Amin, Dr. Gloria Bashir, and Sister Rashida Fitzpatrick, we thank you all for being here, as well as our resident Imam, Tariq El-Amin. Thank you all so much. Wal Asr. Inna lansana lafi kusra. Ila ladina amanu wa amilu salihati. Watwasa bil haq. Watwasa bis sabr. Amin.